Now, key players in Nigeria's energy sector gathered to make their submissions on a new electricity bill at a two-day Senate public hearing. The bill, which comes amidst a major crisis in the power sector, is witnessing radical changes by the Senate to address the lapses. A key purpose of the bill is to clarify the constitutional roles of states and local governments in electricity generation, transmission and distribution, with the role of the federal government in rural electrification. The Minister of Power says the bill waters down the powers of the minister to coordinate and supervise the sector. Let's listen.
This bill, when passed, will usher in the legal framework to stimulate the deployment of relevant regulatory and policy measures that will accelerate growth in power generation capacity, improve utilizations of generated power through increased investment in new technologies that will enhance transmission and distribution of generated power.
Under the EPSR Act 2005, the supervisory powers of the minister to oversee the power sector and offer policy directions were unencumbered. In the bill, these powers appear to be severely diluted, as they are in several areas subject to prior consultation with the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, NERC.
Responsibility without sufficient powers is a challenge for the Commission, and therefore we would want to prevail on the Senate to ensure that the electricity bill clearly empowers the Commission to enforce its regulations and orders, especially on matters relating to corporate governance, business continuity, safety in the industry, and similar matters.
Well, joining me to take a look at this critical issue is Dr. Sam Amadi, who is an associate professor of law and an expert in the power sector. Is the former chairman of the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission, NEC, and I also have Bode Fadikwe, who is an electricity and energy consultant. But gentlemen, before we begin this, Dr. Sam Amadi, I just want to ask if you've been monitoring what's going on in the National Assembly. I mean, we've had voting on several constitutional provisions, amendment of the Constitution. Just before we talk about the electricity issue, I mean, I just learned that the National Assembly presiding officers, including the Chief Justice of Nigeria, have been denied the opportunity to have immunity. I mean, the senators and reps said that they wouldn't allow their own principals to have immunity. What do you make of all of that, including states, local governments being granted autonomy, state houses of assembly also being granted autonomy, and all of this things? What do you make of it?
I think first, I appeared before that Senate committee, and we presented a memorandum on that. But I think we are doing what I call barbecue constitutional reform, and I've argued that constitutional changes in constitution leads to instability. Political scientists argue very clearly. If you look at the most stable societies in the world, they have constitutions that are not altered often. So Nigerian constitutional making is always trying to respond to issues that are not necessarily constitutional. And I think it's taking the joke too far to ask that anybody should have immunity. I mean, the presidential immunity they don't want to give to governors is basically because of the kind of work they do and to insulate them from being harassed. It's not a privilege that goes with high office. Chief Judge has immunity from what? I mean, president officers, local government chairman. So basically, it's a joke, and it's good to wave it away. Now, the other issue around autonomy of local government, again, if you look at a national assembly, state assemblies, if you look at it, it's almost like superfluous. The Constitution provides this kind of independence, if you like, financial autonomy. They are there in the Constitution. So what we are doing is we're trying to constitutionalize political solutions. So because the state assemblies have been pocketed, they're the ones that do appropriation. They're the ones that have power to impeach governors who violate. The Constitution says they have a right to impeach governors for misconduct. So if a governor is not following the appropriation, which is what you create yourself, then you can't impeach the governor, and you think that the constitutional text will do that work for you. Even if you put it there, the governors will overlook it, and it constitutes part of the misconduct which you cannot impeach them because they brought you in and they're embedded. So I think Nigerians are just constitutionalizing failure to deal with political problems. Okay. The laws are very clear. So these are suboptimal. They're not going to change the game.
And it's a big challenge. Actually, the women lost out. Most of the provisions that were meant for them
the
were
women could have been nice, because
including the vice president's wife, despite her presence at the National Assembly.
The men club and
Okay, well, let's come to the electricity sector, actually, and I would like to have your own views here. But look at these reforms. The states are complaining about this issue. The governors, you must have read their objection yesterday. What did you make of it?
I think in the first instance, we must give kudos to the Power Committee for taking this giant step. Thank God Dr. Amadi is here. He's somebody who had been at the highest point of NEC, and he would have seen a lot of challenges that has come with not allowing the states to have a lot of presence in the power sector. I was particularly excited yesterday when the Governors Forum representative made their presentation, and I said that I want to say with all sense of responsibility that was one of the most radical submissions yesterday. They went on to say that, look, we cannot be investing in the network of the discos or the power sector, and you still limit our presence in the sector. For instance,
especially in critical decision making.
Exactly. One of the things that they are concerned about is that they are not allowed to deal with areas that are covered by the national grid. They can only deal with areas that are not covered by the and I ask the question, which part of this country is really not covered substantially by the national grid? So you find out that where they have thrown them to is the far-flung rural areas. Yet within the city centers, they are contributing. There's transmission issue, there's distribution issue, there's generation issue. So when I saw the Senate approving the clause today, or those clauses that now allow them to get involved in generation, get involved in transmission, and I said, yes, this is a very good move, because one, it will trigger competition. What we have right now is a private monopoly being run especially by the discos. The discos are just having a field day of their own. Some people call them special NDA. They are the only one there. But the only ones there. But by the time the states are now allowed to get involved in their own distribution, their own generation, and their own transmission network, you will see, I expect that would trigger a greater level of efficiency, because a customer can now port, as it were, or may be able to move from one service provider to another service provider.
Indeed. I saw that what looks revolutionary at the Senate. I was there when I saw the senators actually voting for states to be able to own their own electricity companies and all of that, including railways and all of that. And I felt some of these, factors will help to contribute. But I really also need to get your own opinion. When the states were protesting yesterday, what exactly was going through your mind?
Yesterday, some people have called me and said, Sam, you should have come to help us. I said, well, they didn't invite me. But let me say it clear. I understand the sentiment, but this is not going to be any important shift. Let me tell you, people argue about the states participating. States, yes, we should remove it from maybe exclusive to concurrent. But look at it, this is a market. The Lagos State government, all states can participate. I license Lagos State Island Power, which they use for their their ring-fenced area, like their hospitals and secretariat. Akwa Ibom has significant power, capable of up to 400 megawatts, even though they can't even generate that much. Rivers had a river IPP, which they sold to Sarah Energy. It was under Amechi and all that. Nothing stops states from generating power, but look at the problem. Now, people talk about states being in distribution. All over the world, you're not going to have more than one distribution company in terms of wire business. That means you can't have two lines. This is network of Abuja Disco and FCT network. Inefficient, it never runs. Even rails are only one. So states can only get involved in retail service. Now, we have bundled distribution and retail into one. That's why you have a monopoly. It's talking about monopoly. That's correct. Because some of these businesses are not businesses that you franchise anyhow. But what we can be talking about is moving to open it up. We are distributing only 400 megawatts, 400 megawatts at max. Abuja has maybe highest 400 megawatts every day. How much megawatts do you have to talk about these competing inefficiencies of state distribution? You made a good point. The framework is lack of creativity and regulatory failure. First, states can actually take up some distribution network even where the discos are networked. If they go to NEC and say that these people can provide the power. And by the way, when NEC gave you a license exclusive, it doesn't mean that you have total exclusion. It means that NEC can still go back and say you're not able to provide effective distribution in this area. For example, I licensed a private distributor in Edo State because that person showed that Benin Disco is not doing enough. Benin says, well, we can't go here. We can't provide the power. Yeah. You can take it. So I think that what we're trying to do, back to the issue I raised before, we are using legislation to address market failure. It doesn't work well because, I'll give you an example. When you say states can set up discos, I know state government and their procurement policies. To somebody who say, I want to build a disco, borrow 500 billion, the disco never goes to market because the sensitive issues around access, market, revenue,
and all of that.
Losses, management, technical, transmission. Look at Oshobo, what we have. They're using phone and they have no SCADA. So is it the state government that will do SCADA? So what I think is that the motive is correct to say, oh, everybody can participate. I'm saying at this stage now, there are many areas the states can participate. I'll give an example, metering. What stops a state from saying, we'll provide a meter and discount it from the revenue, okay? Think again, another area I think they are overlooking is the area of consumer protection. The NEC cannot deal with consumer complaint at the retail level, all the states. Even as former NEC chairman, I receive hundreds of calls, meter this, meter that. Not to stop states from setting up their own NEC equivalent. That's the kind of things they should be talking about.
Okay, to cascade
exactly. So a state NEC can monitor based on NEC's own regulation. They cannot deal with, like in the US, you have what they call public service commissions that deal with all utilities at the state level. So whereas there's a FERC, F-E-R-C in America, that deals with the network, there's a state PCUs, PSCs that manage consumer care. So if, for example, the price is 3 Naira, NEC says, if you are cheating somebody in Owerri, then the state consumer protection NEC, equivalent of NEC, monitors that. So I think we need to be careful technically to bring the real experts to say, look, states can play in this game, but how do you make it? Don't make it look like a lot of Nigeria bazaar, where everybody comes in.
Very interesting. And some of the states like to say that they want to come into the industry until they find out how capitally intensive. They
borrow money and run away.
Yes, and it becomes difficult. Look at Lagos State since we got in 2000 and with the Enron deal and all of that up till date. It's big. It's still a big challenge. But let's talk about the Electricity Power Sector Reform Act generally. This electricity bill, how do you think it will help to deliver more power to Nigerians? Because as we speak right now, the power situation is getting worse.
I think in this regard, I'm constrained to agree with Dr. Amadi. I really cannot see how far this, if it becomes an act, I really cannot see how far it will go. Because the fundamental issue that I think is plaguing the power sector is that of liquidity. The investment in the sector is still so insignificant that legislation alone will not be sufficient to trigger that quantum leap that we expect to take Nigeria to that point where electricity will become something you can say you are taking it for granted in this country. So I think we still have a long way to go, because by the time this one becomes an act of the National Assembly, people will still have to learn the ropes. It will take a bit of time. I don't see this giving us a power sector that we want.
That's what we had thought
in
2005 when we had that it would change the game. It wasn't until 2011 when we started saying it, coming up very well, and until 2013 we saw the discos and all of that being sold. But like you have said, liquidity still remains a big challenge. But it's also the challenge of people recouping their investments. If people cannot recoup their investments, how do you expect them to pump in money into the electricity sector?
That's exactly why the liquidity issue is there, because when they look at what is happening in the sector, and they say, okay, how long will it take me to recoup my money? They become reluctant. Yet, the truth of the matter is that investment in the power sector requires patient capital. It is not something that you put in today and you expect the return to come in tomorrow. It will take a pretty long time for you to be able to recoup. So that's a major challenge. So whoever is coming into the power sector must be ready to be very, very patient before he can recover his money.
And Dr. Amadi, let's talk about how the power situation just keeps going worse. And the federal government most times is still in the business of subsidizing electricity in the country. I mean, a lot of people just keep wondering why the government has to subsidize electricity when the sector is privatized.
If you create an effective regulatory framework for consumer care, which I think NEC cannot do it in a global scale, then you can unlock the pricing. So what that means, for example, even if somebody is paying 40 naira per kilowatt hour in, let's say, Guzo, okay? Every infraction, somebody is on ground to deal with it. The crisis of this sector is low consumer care. Because even if I don't have enough power, for example, schedule, you want to take out 2-3 hours, I should know when those 3 hours will be, okay? If I have only 4 hours power, we can deal with it. So what we need to be doing now, like I said, is we need to be increasing regulatory capability in terms of managing the discourse. 2, leadership. There's been a fall in leadership on the sector. If you look at the Power Act we have already, 80% of the provisions are not yet done. We've not yet done Power Consumer Assistance Fund. We've not yet done contract trading. We've not entered into TEM. So why the rush to reform and amend and increase the complexity without even learning the basic things? So what I think is, look, yes, states can play. And by the way, even without, some of the things we can even do is reduce regulatory threshold from 5 to 10 megawatts, so people can actually generate power their own. Those are the things you should focus on, because the market, the problem is still the market of how do you get finance, how do you manage good quality management, how do you get good investors who know how to manage.
Yeah, who can thought that those were the issues, but we heard the minister worrying more about his own power. By the way, he's going to lose powers in the new electricity bill.
As a matter of fact, he has lost power before even this act. You know, when I was NEC chairman, and that was part of why they didn't like me, the regulator is in charge of this sector more than the minister, because it's like central bank. He controls the market. The minister is general directions, and those directions are already in the code. So really, the role the minister should be playing is actually sitting back and looking at the policies, desktop work, not interfering.
After the privatization, so people were even calling for that ministry to be disbanded, that there was no reason. Since we're going to have a policy and all of that.
Policy. And you know, they don't like the hard work of policy, because it's not a work that brings you face to face to market. It's a work that creates template for NEC to follow. It's difficult. They like the one of jumping in, building access road, building transformers, what the discourse should do if a regulator was supervising them effectively.
Okay, interesting. Now, let's talk about the issue of rural electricity. What role do we have for them in the new electricity bill? Do you think that is something that we should totally separate away from the current provisions? Because, I mean, that was mentioned over and over.
Yes, I remember clearly. I think first and foremost, there seemed to be an attempt to expand the framework or the scope of the Rural Electrification Agency to now include renewable energy. And I think that's a good one, although Energy Commission of Nigeria is saying what they are asking for goes beyond the scope of the REA. That's a matter of details as far as I'm concerned. But I think one of the things that will come forward if they allow REA to move forward along this act is that, one, it will empower them to become more visible. That's one. Two, if they get their acts right, they will begin to encourage more Nigerians to go the way of alternative solution. Three is the fact that it will reduce the pressure if they have a lot of funding. Given the fact that our generation is still at a very, very disturbing level today, it will reduce the pressure on the national grid. Apart from that, people will become more conscious of the fact that you don't have to be on the national grid to get electricity. You can always use alternative solutions. One basic thing about electricity is that every wire that brings electricity to where we are today is connected to themselves up to the power station and back to where the customer is. But with alternative solutions like solar, wind, and all of those things, you can go to the location. We have a lot of these facilities in this country. Take the north, for instance, a lot of heat from the sun. We can trap it and then localize it with it.
Some people have actually been saying, like, for example, we have in the nation's capital, Abuja here, why don't you have the city center on national grid, and then you have solar farms that take care of the satellite towns and all of that to free up power? I mean, why is it that difficult for the government to do?
I think if you look at the 3 points, one is that there's supposed to be, let's say, already a national renewable energy policy. And that's what Energy Commission should be doing, is actually doing research. It's Nigeria, everyone likes to come to limelight. REA should drive that's electrification, and they can do with grid, off grid. Now, what they're not doing is that they're looking for procurement. They don't look, for example, in Rwanda, elsewhere. You use NGOs to do standalone small solutions. So what we should be focusing on is, while we expand the national grid, there are many off-grid solutions, industrial clusters, and mini grids that may not require the complexity of a national grid. So what this REA should be now doing is looking at cost-benefit, most cost-efficient solutions. And by the way, you're right. If you take power for the grid to rural areas that are isolated, especially in the northern part of Nigeria, where communities are isolated, the cost, the transmission loss level is high because you are running wire across areas that have small population. But if you localize intervention for the modular power, then you are freeing that cost, those costs, and then probably they get the power cheaper that they can manage.
Yeah,
so I think that requires innovation policy support and then economic pricing policy. That's what
okay. As we try to round off now because we're losing time, there's this thing that was said by the chairman, Senate Committee on Power, Senator Gabriel Susuam, yesterday, that the Electricity Power Sector Reform Act 2005 is no longer sufficient for post-privatization exigencies, a comprehensive legal instrument which is envisioned in the Electricity Bill 2022 is very necessary. Now, let's talk about why that Electricity Power Sector Reform Act actually became insufficient in such a very short time, because some people have said this law should have still been okay for us.
I think, like I said before, if you look at that law, about 60% of what is provided has not been done. Consultants like to create jobs, and that's what I think happened in the National Assembly, really. There are a few things we can do, like oil electricity theft.
Yeah,
you can provide, even through software regulation by NEC and executive order by the president or the minister. I'd argue that, yes, it's not a perfect law, it has gaps. But the way they are going about reforming it now, we mean that they're going to also create another problem, that we're going to have Rolls-Royce legal framework on a Peugeot or on Okada engine. The point remains that the challenge of this sector is managerial at large, not legal. There are legal gaps, but managerial, they have to do with financing, strong policy, smart regulation, and effective public sector leadership that we're missing for a long while, not by always
very interesting. Is that the reason why we've seen the discos collapsing, having challenges here and there, management issues?
I think essentially that is part of it. That is essentially part of it. Okay,
so how do we ensure that this new law, the electricity bill, is actually one that encompasses all of this and takes care of these basic issues?
I think NEC has a very big role to play. That's the principal regulatory agency. By the time they look at all of the powers that have been given to them, although I am a little bit uncomfortable with the amount of power that has been given to NEC here, because we probably may be seeing a very big neck that is involved in everything, and maybe that's why the minister is a little bit uncomfortable because one of the things that NEC objected to, which is a surprise to me, is the dispute resolution tribunal that is proposed to be created by this bill. I mean, that dispute resolution tribunal will go a very long way to make sure that when there is a dispute between the regulator and the disco, there is an independent party to look at it again.
Councillor framework.
All right. Unfortunately, I've just been told that we do not have enough time. But they've electricity and energy consultant, and Dr. Sam Amadi, who's a Rise News analyst and former chairman of the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission. We must thank you for joining us to take a critical look at the Electricity Bill 2021, which is at the National Assembly right now undergoing review. Well, that's how it's been for this edition of the Arise interview. Do join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja. Goodbye and thank you for watching. I'm Somna Sambi.